So we want to use the following information for questions 19 through 24. A research question of interest is whether financial incentives can improve performance. Alicia designed a study to test whether video game players are more likely to win on a certain video game when offered $5 incentive compared to when just simply told to do your best. 80 subjects were randomly assigned to one of two groups, with one group being offered $5 for a win and the other group simply being told to do your best. She collected the following data from her study. We know based on these data, it looks like $5 incentive is more successful than encouragement because the observed difference in win proportions is a lot different between the people who were asked to earn money and the people who were told just to do their best, of about 35% increased win percentage. We know what type of test statistic would be used to determine whether or not this difference is actually statistically significant. So we have two variables. So this is categorical with two categories. And this is also categorical with two categories. So what that means is if we have two categorical variables, both of them have two categories, then we'd want to do a z-test. But anytime we're comparing two different categorical variables, regardless of how many categories there are, we can also do a chi-square test. So to do a z, you need both of them to have exactly two different categories. To do a chi-squared, they can have two or more. So both A and C would work. So the correct answer would be D. 20 says, what is the null and alternative hypothesis used to test the result? So if we're looking at the relationship between two variables, we're always going to assume that there is no relationship between the two. So you're going to say that the incentive doesn't increase the proportion of people who end up winning the game. So A says the financial incentive is more effective than verbal encouragement. This isn't the null hypothesis. This would be our alternative hypothesis. The $5 incentive and verbal encouragement are equally effective at performing the hypothesis. This would be our null hypothesis. So the correct answer would be B. And then C says verbal encouragement is more effective than a $5 incentive for improving performance. So this is neither of them. So 21 says the p-value Alicia obtained from her study is 0.024. What does this p-value tell you about whether a $5 incentive is effective at improving performance? So A says there's a small chance that the $5 incentive is effective. This is basically saying null hypothesis is true. So the p-value isn't saying whether or not the null hypothesis is true. It's saying how likely the sample would be to occur if the null hypothesis is true. So A is wrong. B says there's a 0.976 chance that the $5 incentive is more effective. This is saying that it's a probability that the alternative hypothesis is true, which again is not the correct interpretation of our p-value. C says the incentive is not effective because the p-value is less than 0.05. So our p-value is less than 0.05. That tells us we reject the null hypothesis, which tells us the $5 incentive is effective, which is what D says. There is strong evidence that the incentive is effective because the p-value is less than 0.05. So the correct answer would be D. So 22 says the p-value is the probability that the $5 incentive group would have the same or lower success rate than the do your best. So that is invalid because it's saying the same or lower success rate. So this lower part is what makes it incorrect, because if it just said the same success rate, then that would be the correct statement, because that would be saying that the null hypothesis, assuming the null hypothesis is true. 23 says the p-value is the probability that the $5 incentive group would have a higher success rate than the do your best group. So again, this is incorrect, because this is just saying the p-value is the probability that the alternative hypothesis is true. So this one would be invalid. And then 24 says the p-value is the probability of obtaining a result as extreme was actually found if the $5 incentive is not really helpful. So this part says assuming the null hypothesis is true. And that's what we want to see when we're trying to determine our p-value. If there was no difference between the $5 incentive group and the just verbal motivation group, then our p-value, the chance that we get a sample addition of 35% or more in favor of the financial motivation group, would happen about 2.5% of the time. So that's the definition of our p-value, and that's what we want to say.